welcome to Stef Talks Trash. I'm your host, Stefanie Valentic, Editor-in-Chief of Waste 360. On this episode, we will be discussing the East Palestine, Ohio train derailment that occurred on February 3rd, 2023. The accident caused more than 115,000 tons of vinyl chloride and other chemicals to spill into waterways and permeate the air and soil in East Palestine and surrounding communities. Despite EPA officials' efforts to alleviate concerns that the water and air are safe, social media videos and media outlets and advocacy groups who have done additional testing have reported otherwise. Joining me today is Mike Schade, Director, Mind the Store for Toxic Free Future. Toxic Free Future is a national leader in environmental health research and advocacy. Through the power of science, education, and activism, Toxic Free Future drives strong laws and corporate responsibility that protects the health of all people and the planet. So first of all, thank you, Mike, for joining me today. Can you please tell me about your background and your work with Toxic Free Future?
Yeah, thanks for having me. Toxic Free Future is a national nonprofit environmental health organization. We've been around for more than 40 years, and we work to protect the public, communities, workers, and the environment from exposure to dangerous chemicals like vinyl chloride. We work to advance strong policies at the state and the federal level to restrict and phase out some of the worst chemicals in the marketplace. Through our Mind the Store campaign, which I lead, we engage and challenge the nation's leading retailers to leverage their market power to reduce and eliminate dangerous chemicals. And we also conduct original cutting-edge scientific research into our exposure to harmful chemicals. For example, we've done a lot of work in recent years addressing chemicals of concern like PFAS. So in sum, we're really working to promote a healthier, safer tomorrow by advancing corporate and governmental policies to safeguard human health and the environment.
That is absolutely interesting. I'm really looking forward to getting into today's topic now after hearing that. Can you first explain what these chemicals are that were spilled on that day on February 3rd and the compounds that were formed as a result of the initial cleanup effort, Norfolk Southern? They called it a controlled burn. So what exactly happened, and what were what compounds, what toxins were released as a result?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So, we have been witnessing, nothing short of a modern environmental disaster playing out in real time. As I'm sure you've seen, a number of train cars derailed, some of which contained highly hazardous chemicals, others contained plastics. The government and first responders intentionally burned some of the train cars containing vinyl chloride. Other train cars also burned during the derailment, for example, some containing plastics like PVC plastic. And this is of great concern because chemicals from the derailment spilled into local waterways. They contaminated the soil, and through the burning of some of the train cars and the so-called controlled burn, a massive plume of hazardous chemicals and soot traveled many miles in communities downwind of the East Palestine train derailment. Some of the chemicals that burned in the fire, like vinyl chloride, are quite hazardous. Vinyl chloride, according to the US EPA, as well as other known authorities, is a chemical that's classified as a known human carcinogen. It can cause cancer in people. And we know that vinyl chloride is linked to different types of cancers, including a very rare form of liver cancer called angiosarcoma of the liver. So the fact that a lot of vinyl chloride was released during this disaster and also burned is of great concern, because when chlorinated chemicals and chlorinated materials burn in accidents and fires, that can lead to the formation of dioxins, which are extremely persistent bioaccumulative toxic chemicals that can be dangerous at very low levels of exposure. So there's real concern that people, fish and wildlife may have been impacted or have been impacted by this disaster. There were, fish that died following the derailment in some of the creeks and streams. near the derailment. There are many people that lived in communities downwind of the derailment who suffered health effects such as bleeding noses, headaches, nausea. And some of these symptoms are consistent with exposure to some of the chemicals that were released during the so-called accidental burn. So this is a massive environmental disaster that continues to play out. We know that even today, 2+ months later, there are people that live in communities that have been impacted by the disaster who continue to complain about health concerns that they believe are attributable to exposure to chemicals and particles from the derailment.
So we're talking about, the ramifications of the controlled burn of the chemicals that seeped into the waterways and the air. And so this is in the surrounding communities, but this actually has, a national impact too, where we're seeing cleanup efforts. We're seeing other states saying, we don't want to accept the contaminated soil or the contaminated waste that's coming in from this disaster. In fact, NBC reported on April 12th, which is the date of this recording, actually, a truck carrying 40,000 pounds of the toxic soil from this train derailment overturned near Youngstown. So this, as I mentioned, the disaster is having these widespread ramifications, and officials are only saying it's going to take 3 months to clean up. But what are we talking about in terms of the long-term environmental impacts? We're carrying waste to different states. We have this waste that's in the community. What's going to happen in the long term?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the 3-month time period is very ambitious, and I, question whether or not is really sufficient or realistic. As I mentioned, one of the big concerns is the possible formation of dioxins. These are extremely persistent toxic chemicals. They're so toxic that they've been targeted for international restriction through the United Nations Global POPs Treaty. These are considered some of the most persistent toxic chemicals on the planet. Dioxins can cause cancer. They've been linked to adverse reproductive and developmental problems. They can have negative effects on the immune system. And importantly, they can interfere with and disrupt our hormones. They're referred to as hormone disrupting chemicals. And as I mentioned, these are really persistent chemicals. They are also bioaccumulative. They can build up in our bodies. The half-life of dioxin is about 7 to 11 years. So if you have one part of dioxin in your body today, it can take 7 to 11 years for that half of it to essentially degrade. So, I don't think we really yet know about what are the long-term impacts of this disaster. We do know that there were water bodies that were impacted in the region. We know that there are people's homes and farms that got contaminated with soot from the disaster. We've been seeing people complaining about health concerns. And as I mentioned, one of the concerns is whether or not soil and other media may have been contaminated with dioxins. The EPA has offered temporary relocation for residents within, I think, a 1 to 2 mile radius that want to be relocated during the cleanup. We're also hearing stories of, not stories, but we're hearing demands from community members who want to be relocated permanently. We're hearing calls for long-term medical monitoring so we can understand what are the long-term health ramifications for people that have been impacted by the disaster, which is something that we've seen with other major environmental tragedies like Seveso, Italy, Love Canal in Niagara Falls. One of the big concerns that we have is right now the EPA is requiring Norfolk Southern to conduct, somewhat limited amount of sampling for dioxins. And one of the big issues one of the big concerns that we and other organizations have, including communities on the ground in East Palestine and other communities in Ohio and Pennsylvania, is the scope of sampling that's being done. We and over 100 organizations across the country recently sent a joint letter to EPA Administrator Regan, raising concerns about the scope of sampling for dioxins that is taking place in East Palestine right now. So there are a lot of long-term concerns that we need to be looking at, from soil cleanup. We need to be monitoring for contamination in groundwater. We need to be looking at the long-term health effects. So I don't think it's realistic to expect that this is all going to be tied up in a bow in 3 months. This is going to be an issue that persists likely for years, we would suspect.
I mean, is it possible to get all of those dioxins removed from the soil, or is this something that they can't completely clean up?
Well, it's not going to be easy. One of the concerns that we have is that the EPA ordered the sampling for dioxins about 1 month after the derailment took place, and since they've begun the sampling, there have been rain events, there have been snow events. The EPA required sampling is really limited to the immediate surface and subsurface. There's concerns about whether or not some of the contaminants like dioxins may have traveled through the soil below the immediate surface and subsurface. There's also concerns about the scope of the sampling. Right now the EPA is only requiring sampling within a couple miles radius of the disaster. And meanwhile, we've heard stories of people's homes and farms that have been impacted by the burn as many as 20 miles away. So one of the key issues is that we think that EPA needs to require Norfolk Southern to expand the scope of the sampling for dioxins in communities much further than 1 to 2 miles away. One of the other issues is that they're primarily requiring sampling where they see visual identification of soot in the soil, and that's insufficient given that there's been rain events, there's been snow events. There probably is not as much soot as there once has been. And then another issue is we also need to be looking at fish, wildlife, farm animals. Over 90% of our exposure to dioxins is from the food that we eat. These are chemicals that can travel long distances in the environment. They can build up in animals, especially fatty tissue of animals like dairy products, eggs, beef, chicken, pork. So we also think that agencies not only need to be looking for dioxins in soil, but also looking in animals, farms, in fish and wildlife downwind of the disaster, and then also looking at other environmental media, looking for dioxins and other contaminants in indoor dust, looking at surfaces, and even looking at filters. EPA could be requiring Norfolk Southern to test for dioxins and filters, and for example, in people's homes. So they really need to do a much more thorough job of expanding the scope of the testing to ensure that people in the communities in East Palestine and further downwind aren't being exposed to potentially dangerous levels of compounds like dioxins. According to EPA, dioxins can be hazardous and even at the low parts per trillion level. And this is why we need the government to do a thorough job to ensure that people in communities downwind of the disaster are not being exposed to potentially dangerous levels of dioxin and other contaminants that may have been released from this major disaster.
From a historical standpoint, is there another disaster or another instance involving dioxins that we could point to kind of relate to or draw parallels to in terms of what exactly could be happening in the long term?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some similarities. I mean, one of the, classic cases in the kind of the waste and the remediation business was Love Canal. Love Canal was a community that was built on top of 20,000 tons of toxic waste in Niagara Falls. They built homes and schools on top of this contaminated site. Over time, the contaminants seeped out of the ground, and dioxins were among the chemicals that were found at Love Canal. And just like at Love Canal, immediately the government said, oh, hey, there's nothing to worry about here, nothing to worry about, nothing going on, the levels are safe. Meanwhile, just like in East Palestine, we saw children and pregnant women who were developing health problems as a result of the contamination. And also, just like in East Palestine, we're seeing a strong organized response from local community groups that are calling for the government to do a much better job to respond to the disaster and safeguard their health. So I think there's some similarities between what's playing out in real time in East Palestine and other environmental tragedies like Love Canal. Another example was Times Beach, Missouri, where there was a community that was contaminated with dioxins that had to be relocated. The homeowners and residents in Love Canal were also relocated. So I think one of the things that is important is that the government should really heed some of the lessons from some of these environmental disasters and not repeat the mistakes of the past at environmental tragedies like Love Canal and like Times Beach, Missouri. And part of that includes being really transparent with impacted communities, conducting sufficient and comprehensive sampling, and then also providing resources to the community so that they can understand, what it might mean to have X parts per trillion of, dioxin in your backyard or in a local park. So one of the things that local groups are calling for is for the EPA to provide technical assistance grants to local organizations such as River Valley Organizing and United for East Palestine, so that they can hire their own technical consultants so that can help them interpret and understand what it means to, help them interpret data that is coming in real time on the levels of contamination in the community. That is something that we've seen done in other major environmental disasters, government providing technical assistance grants to communities. And that's something, for example, that we and others are calling for in East Palestine, which we think would really help improve and build public trust with impacted communities. Right now, the communities that have been impacted really don't trust the government, they don't trust the EPA, they don't trust Norfolk Southern. And if they were to receive a technical assistance grant so they can hire their own scientists to help them understand the data, I think that would be a way to help build trust with the community and help level the playing field between impacted communities, the government, and responsible parties like Norfolk Southern.
So now that we've kind of, spoken about the disaster, and you've spoken about what the EPA, could be done, doing in terms of transparency, what can, the general public, the community, the surrounding communities, what can we take away from this discussion and this disaster that can help us, progress and make change to prevent these future accidents or disasters from happening?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of, a number of lessons learned here. For one, I think it's probably not such a good idea to burn multiple tankers of extremely flammable, cancer-causing chemicals in the middle of a residential community. Now, I understand there was concern that one of the tankers may have exploded, but I think there's real questions of whether or not it was really needed to burn all 5 tankers containing vinyl chloride. I think that if they had only burned one of the tankers, this probably would have been not as bad of an environmental tragedy as it has turned out to be. I think another lesson is, the government shouldn't really be so quick to say that everything is safe and healthy. I think that the government actually, immediately following the burn, they evacuated the community, and within a few days, they started allowing people back into the community. And I think they did that too quickly. They didn't really know whether or not it truly was safe. Not enough sampling had been done. They didn't do any sampling for dioxins at that time, for example. So I think that, when there's not sufficient information, government shouldn't just say, oh, everything is safe, you can go back to your homes, nothing to worry about here, especially when we're seeing people suffering health problems that appear to be attributable to exposure. And it's not just the community. Staff from the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, who was going around in the community conducting surveys of residents, assessing whether or not residents were being impacted, whether health was being compromised. Even government employees with ATSDR started developing health symptoms that were likely attributable to exposure to chemicals. So I think one of the lessons learned really was that they should have not allowed people back into the communities so soon, especially when the smell was still in the air. You could literally smell the burning train cars still in the community. So I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned here, and we sadly, here we are in the year 2021, not really learning all the lessons that we should have from other disasters like Love Canal. And we hope that this disaster could really be a wake-up call for government agencies like the EPA on both what to do in some cases and also what not to do a better job of responding to major environmental tragedies like this for the future.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. If you'd like to find out more about Toxic Free Future, you can go to toxicfreefuture.org. You can watch this episode and other episodes of Stef Talks Trash. You can watch this and other episodes of Stef Talks Trash at waste360.com. Remember, don't be trashy.